Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes the most unlikely people are precisely those whom God chooses to make the greatest transformations? Well, the story I'm going to tell you today is one of those that makes us rethink who we are, what we carry, and how far God can take us, even after so many mistakes. Get ready, because what you're about to discover about the Apostle Paul could become your spiritual key. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow this incredible journey. You won't want to miss any detail of the life and teachings of the Apostle Paul. Imagine someone who was so blinded by religious fanaticism that he persecuted, mistreated, and even murdered anyone who dared to follow the name of Jesus. That was Saul of Tarsus, a name feared among the early Christians. He didn't just participate in these atrocities, led them. But as the Bible teaches, God doesn't look at the outside or the past. He sees purpose and potential. What if I told you that the same man who ordered Christians to be arrested was responsible for spreading the gospel throughout the Gentile world, and that his letters, Paul's famous epistles, still change lives and strengthen hearts today? It sounds like a movie, but it's biblical reality, and what's more, it's proof that no one is beyond redemption. So stay with me until the end, because in addition to learning the most impactful details of Paul's story in the Bible, you will understand how this journey can affect your life too. I guarantee that when you finish, you will never look at your limitations the same way again. Immediately after Jesus' resurrection, the situation in Jerusalem was tense, almost like a pressure cooker about to explode. The disciples were full of courage, openly preaching about the resurrected Messiah, while the religious leaders saw it all as a threat to order. Imagine the scene. On one side, people were being healed and miracles were happening, and on the other, authorities were trying to silence the movement at any cost. Christianity was being born in the crossfire of intolerance. Despite all the persecution, the church only grew. The message of love, redemption, and salvation in Jesus spread like sparks through dry straw. It was as if fear served as fuel for faith. The apostles, even at risk of death, did not back down. In fact, the more they tried to silence them, the more they preached. This teaches us that often the greatest blessings are born in the most adverse environments. In this context, a central figure emerges in the story of Paul in the Bible, Saul of Tarsus. But before we talk about him, it is important to remember that many early Christians were seen as troublemakers, disturbing the public peace. The followers of the so-called way, as they were known, refused to worship the emperor and practice pagan customs. This was enough to be persecuted, imprisoned, or killed. Even so, the message continued. It is beautiful to realize that although the Roman Empire had all the military and political power of the time, it was unable to stop the spread of the gospel. In fact, it was precisely this persecution that scattered Christians to neighboring regions. And just look at the divine irony. One of the people most responsible for persecuting this expanding church would later be the Apostle Paul, but not before experiencing the most impactful conversion of all time. Saul of Tarsus, before becoming the famous Apostle Paul, was a typical respected and feared man. A devout Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, a city known for its culture and advanced education. Saul was no ordinary man. He had been educated by Gamaliel, one of the most renowned teachers of Jewish law. Can you imagine? It was like studying theology with the greatest expert in the country. In addition to being a devoted Jew, Saul was also a Roman citizen, a rare privilege in those days. This gave him rights and access that most Jews could only dream of. But what really drove this man was his blind devotion to the traditions of his ancestors. He saw Christians as a threat to the purity of the Jewish faith and believed that he was serving God by persecuting them. Jesus' followers at that time were called those of the way. And to Saul, this sounded like a dangerous group that needed to be eliminated before it could infect anyone else. He was known for his extreme zeal and willingness to put an end to any trace of this movement. If someone today talks about religious fanaticism, know that Saul will be the perfect example. It is interesting to think how the life of Paul, the apostle of the Gentiles, began like this, carrying letters of authorization to invade homes, arrest men, women, and even children who dared confess Jesus as Lord. His name echoed as a threat in the secret meetings of Christians. But the most beautiful thing about this story is that God, who knows the innermost being, already saw and saw the potential of a great missionary. And Oh, this was just the beginning. If there's a remarkable episode in the story of Paul in the Bible, it is his participation in the stoning of Stephen. He was the first Christian martyr, and the person there approving everything was none other than Saul of Tarsus. As the stones flew, he held the capes of the executioners, as if to say, "You can do it, I guarantee it." This scene has been engraved not only in biblical history, but in the conscience of those who witness human brutality. Before his conversion, the Apostle Paul was practically the nightmare of Christ's followers. He would enter homes, uproot entire families, and take them to prison. It didn't matter if they were men, women, or the elderly. His mission was clear: to eliminate the followers of the way, the group that claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead. In Saul's mind, this was blasphemy and needed to be eradicated. Imagine living in a time when confessing your faith could cost you your freedom or your very life. That was the climate of that nascent Christianity. The first disciples met in secret, exchanging passwords and discreet signs to protect themselves. And yet, Saul managed to capture many of them. His reputation as a persecutor was so great that just hearing his name sent chills down the spines of Christians. The irony is that this man, who dedicated himself to silencing the voice of Christians, would later become the apostle to the Gentiles, someone who would write Pauline letters full of love, faith, and instruction to the churches. But at this point in the story, he was still the villain of the chapter. And what follows shows how God is an expert at turning the tables when least expected. After wreaking havoc in Jerusalem, Saul of Tarsus was not satisfied. He asked the high priest for letters granting him official authorization to go to Damascus, Syria, and continue his hunt. Just imagine a stubborn man crossing kilometers of desert just to destroy anyone who dared to speak about Jesus. It was the persecution of Christians reaching new territories. But it was right in the middle of this journey that Paul's life changed forever. Suddenly, an intense light from the sky shone around him, knocking him to the ground. And to top it all off, he heard a powerful voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Can you imagine how frightened he was? The man who had never been afraid of anything was now prostrate, not knowing what was happening. The most impressive detail is that Saul recognizes something supernatural there and asks, "Who are you, Lord?" And then the answer comes, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." At that moment, everything Saul believed in collapses. The persecution of Christians now made sense in a different way. He was fighting against God himself. And to make matters worse, he became blind, needing to be guided by his companions. So Saul arrives in Damascus completely dependent, vulnerable, and, for the first time, silent. The one who had mastered everything was now groping around. It was the beginning of a spiritual transformation that no one could have foreseen. And you know what? This is a great reminder that sometimes God needs to stop us in the middle of the road to start the story over again in the right way. While Saul of Tarsus was in Damascus, blind and in total silence, God was already preparing someone to enter the scene. His name? Ananias, a faithful, God-fearing disciple, but who was terrified when he received the divine mission. After all, who in their right mind want to get close to the greatest persecutor of Christians? It was as if God were saying, "Today, go and pray for the leader of the persecution." Ananias questioned it. Of course, he told God that this man was dangerous, known for persecuting Christians and causing suffering. But the Lord insisted, "Go, for this man is a chosen vessel of mine." And herein lies one of the greatest lessons from the story of Paul in the Bible. God does not see as we see. While Ananias saw a murderer, God saw the Apostle Paul, who would change the course of Christianity. Ananias, even though he was afraid, obeyed. He entered the house where Saul was and, with the courage that only God gives, laid his hands on him. And at that moment, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he regained his sight. Not only his physical sight, but also his spiritual sight. That man, once a persecutor, now rose up as a servant, ready to experience something completely new. Soon after, Saul was baptized and received the Holy Spirit. And that, my friend, is no minor detail. It is a turning point. From persecutor to disciple, from oppressor to brother in faith. That is why the story of Paul and Ananias is so powerful. It shows that no one is so far from God that he cannot be reached. And from that point on, Saul would never be the same. After that supernatural encounter in Ananias' prayer, Saul of Tarsus wasted no time. He, who had previously hunted Christians, now wanted to proclaim Jesus Christ to everyone. And don't think he started out slowly. Saul, now called Paul, entered the synagogues of Damascus and began to preach that Jesus was, in fact, the Son of God. Can you imagine the crowd's shock? People could hardly believe what they were seeing. The man who had led the persecution of Christians was now fervently defending the gospel. The Jews were perplexed, and the disciples themselves were suspicious. After all, who can say that this wasn't just a cover? But Paul in the Bible became an example of true transformation, and soon his passion for faith began to spread to others. Paul's conversion was so radical that he became a threat to the opposing side. The Jews, who had previously been allies, now wanted to eliminate him. They began plotting his death, forcing the disciples to act quickly. Paul had to be placed in a basket and lowered over the city wall to escape. A difficult beginning, but one that would shape his courage in Paul's future missions throughout the world. It is at this moment that we understand why Paul is called the apostle to the Gentiles. From that moment on, he would dedicate himself not only to the Jews, but to taking the gospel to other peoples, languages, and nations. A man who, from being a persecutor, became a missionary, mentor, and author of the famous letters of Paul, which today inspire millions. And the story was just beginning. Paul's conversion was so impactful that he immediately faced resistance from all sides. The Jews wanted him dead, and the Christians themselves were suspicious of this man who, until recently, was knocking on doors to arrest entire families. Imagine the tense atmosphere you are in the midst of people who do not know if they can trust you. Paul needed double courage and unwavering faith. It was at this stage that the disciples began to see that the change in Paul was real. Barnabas, in particular, played a fundamental role. He believed in Paul's story and introduced him to the other apostles, breaking the initial ice. Without Barnabas, Paul's story in the Bible might have been much more difficult. It's a great lesson for us about giving opportunities to those who are starting over. But even so, Paul's life was far from easy. He faced persecution from the Jews, who saw him as a traitor, and he was also distrusted by the Christians. He was a man caught in the crossfire. For this reason, the disciples decided to take him away from Jerusalem and send him to Caesarea and then to Tarsus. There, Paul entered a time of preparation, away from the spotlight. And do you know what this teaches? That every calling, no matter how great, needs time to mature. Paul, before becoming the apostle to the Gentiles that we know, spent years learning, being molded, facing crises, and maturing in faith. No one is born ready. Not even the greatest Christian missionary escaped this process. After this time of preparation, Paul returns with everything. He and Barnabas are sent by the church in Antioch for what will become the first of Paul's great missions. From there, the apostle to the Gentiles traveled through cities, crossed seas, faced dangers, and planted churches where no one had even heard of Jesus. Paul's missions were not simple journeys. They were true spiritual battles. During these journeys, Paul sought all miraculous healings, amazing conversions, and violent persecutions. Places like Lystra, Derbe, Philippi, Corinth, and Ephesus received the announcement of salvation. And whenever he left behind an organized church, prepared leaders, and steadfast disciples. Paul's life was, literally, a ministry on wheels, or rather, on his own 2 feet and in precarious boats. During these journeys, Paul's famous letters, or epistles, as many people know them, emerged. He wrote to encourage, correct, teach, and answer questions from the churches he founded. Today, these letters make up a large part of the New Testament. Just imagine that Saul of Tarsus, who persecuted Christians, now became a mentor to thousands, even from a distance, through the Word. Paul's missions were so intense that they changed the course of Christianity in the ancient world. He paved the way for the gospel in Asia Minor and Europe and challenged ancient religious structures. If today we have churches in so many different cultures, much of it is due to the missionary impulse initiated by Paul in the Bible. A man with the courage of 10 armies and the faith of someone who had already faced Jesus on the road to Damascus. If there is one thing that stands out in Paul's story in the Bible, it is the number of arrests, beatings, and persecutions he faced. Imagine someone being arrested not for a crime, but for preaching about love, redemption, and salvation. This was the Apostle Paul's routine. Paul's arrests became so frequent that, in some cities, the guards must have even known his name by heart. In Philippi, for example, Paul and Silas were arrested, flogged and chained in a dark cell. But even so, at midnight they sang praises. It's that old saying, those who truly have faith sing even in adversity. And it was precisely there that an earthquake occurred and the prison doors opened. In a scene worthy of a movie, Paul in the Bible did not have an easy life, but he had a purpose. In addition to being in prison, Paul's missions were marked by shipwrecks, ambushes, and stonings. He himself reports in his letters that he was flogged 5 times, suffered 3 shipwrecks, and was adrift at sea. When one reads Paul's epistles, it is impossible not to feel the weight and courage that this man carried. He did not back down because he was certain that he was fulfilling the divine calling. Even when he was in prison in Rome, Paul did not stop evangelizing. It is said that even the guards and staff at the house where he was staying learned about Christ. And it was from this confinement that some of the most moving letters in the New Testament emerged. Paul's story in the Bible is proof that the Word of God is not imprisoned, even when the messenger is behind bars. Even while in prison in Rome, Paul never stopped being a tireless missionary. There, he wrote letters full of faith, hope, and profound teachings, such as the famous 2 Timothy, where he speaks about his finished race and the faith he never abandoned. Physical imprisonment could not hold back the spirit of this apostle to the Gentiles. Paul faces ministry to the end with courage and determination. He knew that suffering was part of his calling, but this never made him give up. On the contrary, each difficulty strengthened him in his mission to take the gospel to those farthest away. His life is an invitation to never give up on our dreams and goals. During his final years, Paul reflected much on what it means to serve God with all one's heart. He urged Christians to stand firm, even in difficult times, and to care for one another with genuine love. His words resonate to this day and inspire thousands of people to live an active and committed faith. Thus, Paul leaves us an example of faithfulness and perseverance. He not only preached conversion, but lived it intensely until the end of his journey. His ministry challenges us to think, how can we be true apostles in our lives, regardless of obstacles? This question takes us straight to the legacy that Paul left. Paul's legacy is so vast that it is difficult to summarize. From a fierce persecutor to one of the greatest missionaries in Christian history, his journey is a living example of transformation and redemption. Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, showed that no one is beyond the reach of God's love, and that faith can turn into new life, even in the most difficult circumstances. His missions and letters shaped Christianity as we know it today. Paul's epistles are fundamental references for Christian doctrine, addressing topics ranging from grace to justice, from faith to ethics. When we read Paul's letters, we see a man who knew deeply about human struggles, but who also had a clear vision of divine purpose. Furthermore, Paul taught us about unwavering courage and obedience. His life in the Bible inspires leaders, missionaries, and ordinary Christians to persevere, even in the face of opposition and imprisonment. Paul's story in the Bible is not just an ancient narrative, but an invitation to live with passion and commitment wherever we are. Finally, Paul left a legacy that spans generations. His example is a constant reminder that true change begins with surrender and faith. Paul's life not only impacted the early church, but continues to inspire thousands around the world to walk in God's purpose, with the certainty that conversion can transform even the hardest hearts. When we reflect on the incredible journey of Paul of Tarsus, it becomes clear that each of us has the ability to transform our own story, regardless of our past or the difficulties we have faced. Have you ever thought that, just like Paul, a decision can completely change the course of your life? And what's more, what have you done to nourish your faith and remain steadfast in your purpose, even when things get tough? How about being inspired by the courage and perseverance of the apostle to the Gentiles to take a step today? Whether it's by starting to read Paul's letters, dedicating some time to reflection, or even sharing this message with someone who needs hope. After all, it's in daily practice that transformation happens. If this story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel to receive more content that will strengthen your faith and renew your mind. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos and be part of this journey of spiritual growth with us. Are you ready to experience your own conversion? What legacy do you want to leave for the world? Think about it and count on me to move forward.